Hey folks, Steve here, talking The Silencers, Margot Nash film, and that is Margot on the cover, on the sand, um, with a big umbrella over her. And the film is essentially about Margot and sort of what happens when you are the star of your movie. She's also the narrator of the movie. Even though the movie is it's not actually about Margot as much as her mother and her relationship with her mother and a strained relationship with her mother. And we're sort of asking some questions here, ethically. What happens when you're making a film about somebody and that somebody is no longer around, and they don't have a right of reply. I suppose. The questions about could you have made this movie, you being Margot, if Mum was still alive, and she has answered no in the past. So it's some interesting questions about narrating real people, social actors and social actors who don't have that right of reply. It was critically acclaimed, this film, The Silencers. The best film of the year, as declared by me, Stephen Gaunson, Film Alert 101. We should... I always liked that guy. I always thought he had interesting things to say about the movies, and if he says best Australian film of the year, I'm with him. I'm with him all the way. I'm with you, Steve. Heartbreaking, soulful and uplifting, also declared on the cover by Adrian Martin. Okay, let's get into it, shall we? The question about the film is, whose film is it? Like, who actually owns the film? Who drives the narrative? Who is the subject and the star of the movie? And it's really kind of Margot's movie. It's her response to her own upbringing. And the interesting thing about the film is the way that when you're outside a family and you're looking in, that family can seem very normal. And when you're inside that family behind closed doors, that experience is not the same experience. And, there's a number of those kind of domestic documentaries that you could compare this film to. Catching the Freedmans would be another interesting one about a dysfunctional family. Not that this family is being accused of particular things that is going on in a film like Catching the Freedmans. Anyway, whose story is it? Father's story? Is it the mother's story? And what responsibility did Nash, as in Margot, have in the telling of their story? Because both of these people are dead when she goes to make the movie, and what can you say? Now you can sort of say, well, it's her story, it's her view, it's her take. Well, that's fine, but you are actually dealing with people here whose sort of reputations, you could say could be tarnished quite significantly due to certain representations of them. And what responsibility do we have to depicting and discussing the dead? I said ultimately she makes the film about her experiences. I think to her credit, and the reason why I would say this is an ethical film, as opposed to a number of other films that I could name right now, she only ever tells her story. It's always her interpretation of her father, her interpretation of her mother, and the way that Margot actually cuts in scenes and moments from her other film, which kind of play as sort of reenactments, is really fascinating. And, the fact that she narrates it is very much from her point of view, which I think is worth noting right now. So the family photographs, there's a whole bunch of family photographs which play across the film. What role do the photographs play in the telling of this film? And how do they substitute for talking heads? I really like this film in the way that you don't have a lot of talking heads. Well, you can't really have a lot of talking heads, can you, if those talking heads aren't talking anymore, if you know what I mean. But you've actually got to put in a visual image for those people. And there's family photos, and the way that she uses those photos, these archival photos, really, really fascinating stuff. And, it's a very, I think what you've got here is somebody who really knows how to construct memory on the screen, because all of Margot's films are about memory to some degree or another. Science is about awareness and lack of awareness also. Margot not being aware of particular things that was going on in her family as a child, and then becoming aware of those things later on. Nash doesn't demonize her parents, and I think that is important, and important to compare that to sort of other films in the course. She spends considerable time painting a picture of their lives, desires, and frustrations. She has a lot of empathy for them, even though she is actually quite honest. It's not a, I don't know if sentimental, how I would use that word in describing this film. I don't think it's anti-sentiment, but it's certainly not sentimental in the way that we often use that term. She doesn't attempt to shape a simple positive message from her experiences either, which is important to say. Now, Kit McFarlane, who wrote a really interesting piece on the silences, which you can read, she wrote this: "It may be reductive to refer to the silences simply as a film about mental illness, but the documentary coincides with some hopefully ongoing, albeit shaky, steps in the media and in politics towards increased awareness about and discussion of mental health in society." And I think that is an interesting point, that, her father had, depression, bipolar. He wasn't a well chap. And it confronts that. It confronts that directly, but it does it in a more positive way than a lot of other films do. And the film isn't about mental health. It's not a mental health film. But the father suffered from mental health, and that infected the entire family unit. And I think that the way that Margot is able to incorporate that into the film is really, really interesting. And again, ethically, I think she handles that really, really well. Now, for the most part, it avoids making those broad positive statements. There's little attempt to persuade the viewer that the story being presented will have larger cultural ramifications, or that the characters involved are particularly emblematic of society at large. And that's either going to be what you really like about the movie, or it's going to be what you don't like about the movie. Margot could have easily made broader statements about family, about mental health, about sister relationship, about a whole bunch of stuff. But she doesn't. She makes it very insular, in that she's talking about her experience from this particular family. And that's really interesting, I think, the way that she does that. And she does it in a very professional way. The experiences are Nash's, or her interpretations of others' experiences, and her narration keeps the immediacy of the context grounded and focused. And think about the narration and how she uses narration. And, there's a lot of films, a lot of directors who narrate their own movies. Nick Broomfield being the most famous one, where, Nick wants to announce his greatness and his presence in, what he's doing. Margot Nash isn't doing that. I think she's talking from the heart and her own personal experience, and it's a very brave film in the way that she's confronting her mother and past issues that she's had with her mother and her father, and to a lesser degree, I think, her sister. Now, the silencers can arguably be criticised for not providing a particularly practical outcome for the personal story. And that's the thing, like I was saying before, it's not saying, here's the problem, well, here's the solution. It's actually just saying, well, here's the problem. Which I like, and I think it's not forced. There's something very natural and organic and terribly sad about this film. And the way that the film kind of shapes, the adults that we become are so much shaped by these experiences that we have as children, and that Margot's willing to actually discuss that and talk about that through her own experience rather than others more broadly. Now, this would be a question of how the personal narrative can be abstracted and generalised for broader application. And I think that's worth unpacking, that very idea. And we can do that in the classes. How can the intensely personal be made to inform larger questions and problems? And what I like about the film is it's sort of saying, well, here's a personal story, here are personal problems. Let's take those issues and those ideas and let's actually think about them more broadly through broader things, which I really do dig. Reenactments, like I said before, the film kind of plays, it feels like we're watching a reenactment, but we're actually watching Margot Nash's other films, earlier films. And, she sort of says in the film, she didn't realise how autobiographical her earlier films were. I mean, she just have scenes of stuff. She's always interested in family, but she didn't realise how much that was actually coming from her own memory of her family. And certainly her father and the way that he has been depicted in particular films. Now seemingly showing a series of fictional surrogates and the actors being the surrogates to her family, reliving the historical reality being presented to us. And that's intentional as well, I think, in the way that she's actually using these older clips. I said this effect is beguiling and also perhaps intriguingly misleading. And what I mean by that is you will watch the clips in this film and you will read those films in a particular way. And you will think, okay, well, I'll go back and I'll watch those films because, they're kind of narratives about Margot's life. And they're actually not. They're not that at all. And the question is, if you take a clip, whether it's found footage or whatever, and you kind of interpret that to suit a narrative, even though it actually kind of, in a way, contradicts the original place and source and meaning of that work, is that actually a problem? And should that sort of been declared that you can look at certain scenes from Margot's films and you can interpret them in regard to her own personal story, but if you actually watch those films within their context of the original film, it actually tells a very different story. Interested to know what we have to say about that. Just some conventions, expository conventions. Voiceover directly addresses the audience. That's very much there. And I like to talk to you about how the voiceover is used. Attempts to persuade the audience a particular point of view. Interesting how Margot depicts herself and narrates herself into the story, and that's worth having a chat about. Reflexive conventions, Burroughs technique from fiction film. Well, you've actually got sequences from fiction films. And, in a way, you could sort of say this film is a docudrama. I wouldn't, but you could. And that would be worth talking about through the reflexive conventions. Performative, well, it's another director making a film about themselves and putting themselves in the film and narrating the film. And that's interesting and kind of fascinating. And, there's something very subjective about it in that there is no escaping the director from the person on the screen. And it's it's not Margot's film. Like, it is Margot's film. Obviously, she's the director, but it feels like it feels um, like it's really about a child's memory of this family, and it's certainly about the mother, and the mother is the center of this world that's being depicted here. Just a final thought. How do you feel about Margot, not Marot, that I wrote here? That's just a typo. But how do you feel about Margot by the end of the film? Worth discussing that. How does the film want you to feel about Margot? Do this to match. So how do you feel, viewer, critical thinker, talking to you? How do you feel about Margot by the end? Do you like her? Are you with her? Do you feel for her? Are you crying with her? Shaking your head at her? And how does the film want you to feel about her? And how do these two match? I mean, it is very difficult when you're making a film about yourself because you want to depict yourself in a particular way. And I mean, I said it's subjective, but is that a problem that there is no objectivity to what's being depicted here? The favorite quote: "The art of a good documentary portrait is to gain your subject's trust and then betray them." Whose trust is gained, and then how's that betrayed? Interestingly, Margot's sister, who was sort of involved in the film, but she wasn't. I mean, she said, "Well, Margot, this is your story," and she actually disagrees with a lot of Margot's memories of the family, which is kind of interesting. We'd like to see Margot's sister's film. That could play as a double header. But she kind of disagrees with a lot of what's being depicted here. Anyway, her sister lives in New Zealand because, Margot's originally from New Zealand, as the film will discuss. And the sister, sort of helped her getting the photos and things like that. And the film premiered in New Zealand, and the sister went along with her book club and was just mortified by what she saw. And she kind of asked Margot not to release the film in New Zealand, and Margot complied and said, "All right, no problem, I won't." And so the film has never actually been released in New Zealand. So if you're watching this YouTube video from New Zealand, hello, Kiwi friends, how are you? And you're probably very keen to see this film that we're talking about called The Silencers. Well, I'm sure you can get it through some sort of online source, but or maybe you can't. I don't know. If you're in New Zealand, let me know if you've been able to see this film. But anyway, that's kind of interesting, and I think it's like ethically, good on Margot for not releasing the film. Because she doesn't want to piss off her sister. Why would you? But if it's caused that sort of response from her sister, are there issues in the film that could have been discussed? Or is her sister being betrayed, I suppose? Is her mother being betrayed? Is her father being betrayed? Is Margot betraying herself? That's interesting, isn't it? She was to gain her own trust and then betray her own trust. Is the story told ethically? And that's the real question about this. I mean, can you ever be 100% ethical when you're making a movie about other people? And probably not. Anyway, I will now go into silence. Because, it's interesting. A film called The Silencers doesn't really have many moments of silence. A lot of sounds are heard across the film. But anyway, I will now be silent and I will end this lecture here. And I look forward to watching this with you, which is a beautiful looking film. It's a really terrific looking movie, and I like it a lot. As my quote on the DVD cover would demonstrate. Film of the year, I thought, back in the year it was released, which I think was like 2015. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to watching this movie with you by Margot Nash. All right, bye for now, and see you soon.